Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Today we are taking a deep dive into something that affects all of us, especially us here in Deer Park, LaPorte, and Pasadena. The role of money in our elections. And to understand this, we are going all the way to the Supreme Court with a case called Citizens United v. Federal Election Commission. Buckle up because this one is a wild ride.
You know what's fascinating about Citizens United? It all started with a really simple question. Could a group called Citizens United, it was a nonprofit organization, could they release a documentary that criticized Hillary Clinton during the 2008 election? You would think that would be protected under the First Amendment right.
Seems pretty straightforward. Free speech, right?
Exactly. You would think. But at the time, there was a federal law that said corporations and unions couldn't just use their general funds to pay for communications. That mentioned a candidate close to an election.
Oh, so there were some rules in place.
Interesting.
So Citizens United said that law was a violation of their free speech rights.
They said it was unconstitutional.
Yeah.
And they took it all the way to the Supreme Court.
It's a big deal.
Oh, yeah, it's huge. The court's decision in Citizens United, it was a 5-4 decision, and it actually overturned 2 previous rulings that had backed up those limits. On corporate spending and politics, basically the majority opinion said, corporations are made up of people, and those people have the right to free speech, even if they exercise that right through a company. They argued that limiting how a corporation spends money to get their message out is basically like silencing an individual.
So they are saying that a corporation, even a huge one, has the same free speech rights as a person. When it comes to spending money on politics,
Exactly.
that's a pretty bold statement.
It is, and it sparked a lot of controversy.
I bet.
Yeah, the dissenting justices were really worried. They argued that corporations, especially huge ones, have so much more money than any person, and giving them this unrestricted power to spend money on elections could completely distort the entire political process. They worried that it would give big corporations an unfair advantage and undermine public trust in democracy.
So you are saying that some of the justices were worried that corporations would have too much power.
Yes.
And that it could hurt our democracy.
Exactly. Justice Stevens actually said that unlimited corporate spending could drown out the voices of everyday citizens and make people feel like their votes don't even matter. Like the only thing that matters is which corporation spends the most money.
That's a scary thought, especially for us here in Deer Park, LaPorte, and Pasadena.
Right.
If a big corporation wants to support a certain candidate or push a certain policy, they could have way more influence than us.
Yeah, it's something to think about.
Definitely. So how did the court address that concern, that corporations would have too much influence?
Well, the majority on the court pushed back on the idea that corporate spending automatically leads to corruption. They didn't think that corporations spending money to support a candidate would automatically lead to quid pro quo, where politicians are basically trading favors for cash. They saw it more as a free speech issue.
So they're basically saying that a corporation spending money to support a candidate is no different than a group of citizens pooling their money.
Right.
To put up a billboard or something.
Right. It's all about expressing your views.
I see. But then what about the dissenting justices? Did they think that corporations would just be spending all this money and not expecting anything in return?
That's where things get really interesting, and we will dig into that right after the break.
Yeah, the dissenting justices were really concerned. They said that corporations, especially the really big ones, they have access to so much money, way more than any individual could ever have. And Justice Stevens, he was worried that this huge amount of money could create a system where politicians are basically puppets, controlled by whoever has the most money.
It's like that saying, he who pays the piper calls the tune. I can see how that could happen, even here in Deer Park or Pasadena.
Right.
If a big corporation with lots of money wants to support a certain candidate, or they want to push for a specific law to be passed, they would have a much bigger advantage than individual voters like us.
Yeah. So how do we make our voices heard when these corporations have so much influence?
That's the big question, isn't it? The Citizens United ruling, it basically opened the door for corporations to spend a lot more money on elections. And now it is up to us to figure out how to deal with this. We have to be smart and pay attention to who is paying for these political messages we see on TV or hear on the radio. And we have to ask ourselves, do these messages really represent what our community needs? Or are they just helping the corporations that are paying for them?
So we can't just believe everything we see and hear during election season. We need to do our research and figure out who is really behind these campaigns.
Exactly.
That makes sense. But before we go any further, I'm curious about how this whole thing got started. You mentioned earlier that Citizens United wanted to release a documentary about Hillary Clinton. What was that all about?
Oh, yeah. That's where this case began. Citizens United made this film. It was called Hillary, the movie. And it wasn't very flattering. They wanted to release it on demand. But they ran into those campaign finance laws that we were talking about. They said that their film was a form of free speech protected by the First Amendment, and that these restrictions were not fair.
So they said that the government couldn't stop them from releasing their movie.
Right.
And the Supreme Court agreed with them.
They did.
Wow.
The court said that even if it's a documentary, corporations still have the right to express their political opinions.
So even though this whole thing started with a movie, it ended up changing how we think about corporations and elections. It's amazing how one case can have such a big impact on our entire country.
It really is.
And it wasn't just about big national corporations.
No, it wasn't. This decision affected all kinds of corporations, big and small, nonprofits, even labor unions. It changed the rules for anyone who wants to use their money to get involved in politics.
So now I'm starting to see how this connects to our lives. Here in Deer Park, LaPorte, and Pasadena, we have lots of different corporations in our area. Energy companies, real estate developers, local businesses. And this ruling gave them more power to participate in our local election.
Exactly.
Which means they could have more influence on everything that happens in our community, from zoning decisions to who gets elected to city council.
Right.
So the big question is, what can we as residents, what can we do about this? How can we make sure our voices are heard when corporations are spending so much money to influence our elections?
That's what we need to figure out.
Okay, so we've talked about how Citizens United changed things when it comes to corporations spending money on elections. But the question I have, what can we actually do about this? How can we make sure our voices are heard, even with corporations spending so much money?
Well, that's the thing. Even though Citizens United gave corporations more freedom, it didn't take away our power as citizens. In fact, it might make our involvement even more important.
So it's like a wake-up call. We can't just sit back and watch.
Exactly. We need to be active in our communities. We have to pay attention to local elections, do our research on the candidates, and look at who is donating money to their campaigns.
So knowledge is power.
Yes.
But what do we do with that information?
That's where getting involved locally comes in. That's what Think and Act Locally is all about. We are trying to empower residents of Deer Park, LaPorte, and Pasadena to make a difference in their communities. We provide information on local issues, elections, and ways to get involved. And remember, local elections often have lower voter turnout, so your vote matters even more.
That's true. It's easy to feel like your vote doesn't count in a national election. But in local elections, your vote can really make a difference.
Absolutely.
What are some other ways people can get involved?
You can connect with your neighbors, join community groups, and speak up about issues that are important to you. You can go to city council meetings, write to your representatives, and support candidates who share your values. Even small actions can have a big impact.
So it's all about getting involved.
Yes.
But what about the money issue? How can we as individuals compete with corporations that have so much money?
Well, we don't necessarily have to match them dollar for dollar. There are other ways to level the playing field. You can support organizations like Think and Act Locally. You can volunteer your time, or you can help us spread the word.
So it's more about working together.
Right.
Using our collective voice.
Exactly. And don't forget about the importance of a free press. Support local journalism. Read independent news sources. And be critical of the information you are consuming.
That's good advice. This has been a really informative deep dive. What is the one thing you want our listeners to remember?
I want them to remember that Citizens United was a big decision, but it didn't take away our power. We can still make a difference in our communities. It starts with being informed, getting involved, and staying active.
And remember, Think and Act Locally is here to help. If you like what we do, please consider supporting us. You can find a link to donate in the show notes. Your donations help us keep providing this information to our community.
We believe that everyone should be informed. Let's work together to make our democracy stronger.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious and keep thinking and acting locally.